Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. It's a little bit of an early event for the festival, so thank you so much for being here. My introduction this morning is going to be pretty long, so I'm going to get to it. But again, thank you for joining us this morning. This is our last full day of the 2021 Montana Book Festival. We have a couple one-off events in the next couple weeks, but this is our last full day. So thank you to those of you who are joining us for the, 30th time, first time. Thank you so much for being here. This is a Montana Book Festival event featuring Anthony W. Wood, Tobin Miller Shearer, and Amelu Ruff. This event is sponsored by a number of different organizations and businesses, including Arts Missoula, MissoulaEvents.net, the Whitefish Review, Humanities Montana, and the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation. An enormous thank you to our sponsors and our supporters. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. I am zooming in from my office, as I usually am, in the Mountain Press Publishing Company building here in Missoula, Montana. The Montana Book Festival acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel peoples. The name Missoula comes from the Bitterroot Salish word in Mijuletko, which means place of freezing water. This name has been used for over 12,000 years since the existence of Glacial Lake Missoula. The first Europeans who came here borrowed the Salish term in Mijuletko and modified the word to Missoula. Later, when Glacial Lake Missoula melted, the Bitterroot Salish began using an additional term for Missoula, which means place of the small bull trout. In 1855, the Bitterroot Salish were forced to sign the Hellgate Treaty, and following this treaty, the United States government carried out forced assimilation, removal, and genocide against the Salish and other peoples in their efforts to acquire land. Yet despite centuries of colonial theft and oppression, the Tutiacan people are still here and thriving on their Aboriginal lands. The Montana Book Festival strives, and we will continue to strive to help promote Indigenous voices as one of the ways our organization acknowledges and respects the Aboriginal peoples of Missoula. For those of you zooming in from outside Missoula, including our panelists today, I encourage you to let us know where you're zooming in from. Andy Smith, who is an MBF volunteer, is on the back end of things, is going to throw a link in the chat that can help you identify which territories you are currently occupying. If you'd like, go ahead and throw your locations into the chat. We'd love to know where you're zooming in from. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our panelists this morning. We really would love you to engage with this conversation that's going to take place. So please throw any questions you have for Anthony, for Tobin, or for Amelu into the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which is a little different than the chat. The chat is for you to have conversations amongst yourselves. Andy's going to be throwing out book links, and that's certainly a different place to engage. But if you have questions directly for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A. They'll get to them at the end of their conversation. Like I said, Andy Smith is on the back end of things. I will be on the back end of things as well, and we'll take care of any logistical questions you might have about this conversation, about the festival, anything like that. I want to note that if you're interested in purchasing Anthony Wood's Black Montana, you can do so through our festival bookseller, Fact and Fiction Books, here in Missoula, Montana. You can do so in person or at factandfictionbooks.com. Please be sure, whether you're purchasing Black Montana or any other festival title featured in this conversation or elsewhere throughout these last 2 months, that you're using MBF, a code at checkout. 20% of those sales will come back to the festival so that we can continue programming like this. So with that spiel over, I would love to introduce you to our panelists this morning. Anthony W. Wood is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Michigan. He worked as a historian for the Montana Historical Society on Montana's African American Heritage Places Project. He is the author of Black Montana, Settler Colonialism and the Racial Frontier, 1877 to 1930. Welcome, Anthony.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Of course, good to see you. Tobin Miller Shearer is a history professor and the director of African American Studies at the University of Montana. He is the author of 6 books and more than 100 articles on African American history, race, and religion. Welcome, Tobin.
Good to be with you all this morning.
And Amelu Ruff is a student in the African American Studies program at the University of Montana, who writes of herself, quote, "I want to be on a journey where I continue to grow fearlessly and to love unconditionally, to welcome new things and new people as they come. I want to keep using my voice powerfully to stand for every person who needs an ally and to question the systems put in place to separate humanity and fight for equity and togetherness, end quote. Amelu, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, you three, I am going to go ahead and skedaddle on the back end of things. And thanks so much for being here and have a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you. So I'm gonna start out with just a really quick recap and synopsis of the arguments of the book and really what the story was that I had hoped to tell. And I'm going to try and do it in a way that if you haven't had a chance to read it, or if you're interested in reading it, that I hope it will help the process of engagement when you do. So this project came about, as Laura mentioned, because I was working for the Montana Historical Society and the State Preservation Office there. And we were looking for buildings and businesses, homes associated with the historic Black community here in Montana, roughly from around the turn of the century and earlier. And through that process, I was first tasked as an undergrad, and then later after I graduated and started working for the Historical Society, I was tasked with finding buildings and structures that was associated with this community. And when we went about mapping both the historic structures that were still around, as well as those that had been demolished over the past century, what we found was that in most of Montana's 6 or 7 largest cities, in many cases, fewer than 20% of those original buildings survived, and that was in spite of the fact that many of those destroyed buildings had once existed within historic districts and neighborhoods where places where communities had made efforts to preserve buildings and homes and such. And this got me into the question of thinking about, well, this community that was once kind of thriving in Montana about 100 years ago or more, and the physical remnants of it, which we can see has been kind of eroded away. Well, what has happened to the stories of those Black Montanans, the networks of community and kinship that they created, and how can we account for the seeming loss in many cases of those stories, which in my research, the buildings were really just symbolic of. And so that became the beginning questions of the book, which was to discuss how do we account for erasure and this particular type of destruction of Black voices and Black history in Montana. So to do this, while I was in grad school, I became interested and convinced that one of the ways that we had to bring this story into a kind of a fuller and more to bring it into a kind of a fuller, more robust picture would be to consider the role of racial ideology in Montana, especially as that racial ideology developed within the settler conquest of indigenous peoples and lands. And that was going to change and affect not only how white settlers imagined race, racial exclusion and belonging in their place that they were building and calling home, but it would also affect how Black Montanans of that time period were encountering racial ideologies that were slightly different, were being retooled and reused to new purposes here in the West, and how they responded and in many cases, dissented to those racial ideologies. So that was the main purpose of the book. And throughout, I try to take that question and account in each chapter a different type of thematic lens, where I'm looking at the creation of a home as a concept through neighborhoods and ways of being and the lives that people built. I'm also looking at it in the space they're creating in settler colonial societies. Space is an incredibly important concept because it is through the displacement of indigenous peoples that settlers kind of replace in their minds the original inhabitants and make a home for themselves. And then also the cultural kind of connotations behind what it means to call a place home. Black communities in the early parts of the 20th century and late 19th century, they too made certain claims to cultural forms of belonging, and those claims, which I try to argue in the book, were countered very deliberately by the white settler community and the elites in the state in ways that show, I think, that a colonial racial ideology was prevalent and affecting the Black community in really tangible ways. And then leading up to the end of the period which I look at, which is not the end of Black history in Montana by any means, but it was nearing the end of the community which I looked at, which had really arrived and maintained a lot of connections to those first neighborhoods and enclaves and networks which were established in the late 1870s and 1880s and had grown through the 20th century. And by 1917, we have kind of this watershed year of strife and World War and the Spanish influenza pandemic and an environmental bust, and that comes in the form of a major drought that lasts several years, and some major demographic upheavals which lead to white settler society kind of unraveling. And in that unraveling, the exclusion which they had long been perpetrating and building up against Black settlers' ability to call Montana home really comes to a head, and we start seeing the Black population in Montana decrease by over 50% between the end of from 1910 to the Second World War era. So it's that particular arc that I try to follow in the book, and in doing so, I hope that I also tell a lot of useful and important stories about early Black Montanans and the lives they led. So I will leave it there, but I'm very happy to talk with everyone and have some questions and discuss things further.
Amelu, you want to do some response? I know you got some stuff you want to say.
Yes, absolutely. So I am Amelu, and I love to speak. Let me remove my jacket. I didn't have a chance to read fully throughout this book, but I picked up on a few main ideas just at the very beginning of it. And one of those is just at the very beginning where African slaves are being removed and put into like Native American land that white settlers had already invaded. And I just thought there's such animosity between these two groups of people. And I want to look at why and how did they get there? Because these are two groups that experience extreme oppression, but they're against each other. And when you step away from it and look at our history, the one connection between it is white supremacy and this ideal of white being the superior race. And so it's interesting because, like in my idea, you would think they would combat together to go against this force, but there's only so much space, like you were saying, and opportunity for a certain amount of people. And in my personal experience of being a Black woman, especially here, a Black woman going to college, I feel like there is only a certain amount of us that can succeed here because there aren't that many resources that say that all of us can succeed. And so it does put us sometimes in this position where it's like, like I want my friend to get this opportunity, but that also means it's taking away from my personal opportunity and growth. And so I think that aspect of it is super, super interesting. And I kind of relate it more to an updated version, but I was learning about the LA riots after I believe she was a 16-year-old that was killed by Korean American. I'm not sure if the details are correct exactly. And that just created an uproar with the Asian Americans and then the African Americans. And so it's just that same story perpetuated because they got pushed into one area where there isn't that much opportunity for everyone. And now Asian Americans are coming over into these established neighborhoods where there's Black representation, Black businesses, and the money's staying within the Black community. But then this outside force comes in and invades their space. And yes, they're just as poor, just as lack of opportunity, but they are closer to that superior white Aryan race. Therefore, Black gets even pushed down to the lowest and then totem pole. And so I think that's super interesting because it's still super prevalent right now. I mean, look at like the Black Lives Matter and then the Asian American hate. And then within those two groups, each side was like saying, well, why aren't you standing up for Black Lives Matter, but you want me to stand up for Asian Lives Matter? And there's such animosity between them too. And the only tie that you can connect it to is that they are below a caste of white supremacy. And everything else falls into those categories. And so I think that it definitely, yeah, I just think that relationship of displacing a certain group of people and then moving in another group of people and saying, hey, you're going to be extremely oppressed in society, but we want to see you fight for opportunity, fight each other, cut each other's throat. And I just feel that personal pressure, even just existing, being a talented multimedia, like I write poetry and I sing and I can dance and all this stuff. But sometimes it's like, well, I don't want to take this opportunity away from another Black person that maybe doesn't have a Tobin to help get a scholarship, or maybe doesn't have someone that to tell them about discussion panels like this. And so I guess my question is, how do we create that, especially in a place like Montana that has been historically known to not create that much space for Black people? Those are kind of my thoughts after I read it.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Amelu.
Yeah.
That's great.
Now, I don't know if anyone noticed, but I actually got kicked off for just a little in the middle.
Yeah.
I think I can put it back together, mostly because this is something, it is a sentiment which I've come across a lot, and just speaking with people who have read the book. And when I talk about, I'm working on this element of history, in which I think is incredibly important to both the place and the people who live here. So often that is a very similar kind of immediate reaction, especially when I explain and start talking about the way that colonialism kind of has informed the history that we should talk about. And so I would say that the creating that space where the solidarities can form, where people can kind of come to terms with the structures and systems that have been in place for centuries, and move to a different space where a different way of being can kind of begin. Part of that is recognizing how it has worked in the past, and understanding that, in my very, very kind of specific examples here from the book, is that settler colonialism and white supremacy often operate by, like, the way it moves in the world is by pitting people against one another. It probably, and that I think suggests, and a lot of scholars have said this, it doesn't survive well when when people are capable and willing to make those advances towards meaningful solidarities that are aware and conscious of how power is working in these societies. So I think that I can only offer tiny little bits of help as a historian, but in this case it is just saying this is how we can kind of look to the past. We can see this historically play out, and we would be in many cases expecting, I think, to find, as you mentioned earlier on, that you would expect to find solidarities forming. And I honestly did expect to find this. In my research, especially with Black newspapers, I was convinced that as I read through them closely, one of the things that I would come upon is at least some tacit understanding that indigenous peoples, in the early 20th century, even in Montana, that's when the reservations here are going through the allotment process and being kind of broken and opened up. I really did expect to find newspaper editors and people writing in saying that we should be careful. This is a form of oppression, not very dissimilar from the type that we have been experiencing in our history and in this place and in America generally. And instead, what I've found is I believe the space where those conversations, I have to think, likely happened in private. But at the same time, I also found people's voices that kind of seemed in some ways to be playing into and leaning into that form of dispossession. But in doing so, in this broader context, they're kind of adopting of colonial language in many cases was fundamentally subversive to the very idea of white supremacy that underlay dispossession of indigenous peoples and oppression of non-white peoples generally. So it was a complicated and it was kind of an unexpected, but I think that coming to terms with that historical moment can help people in the present, and has been helping for some time, people form those meaningful solidarities.
I wanted to just say another thing while you were speaking that I thought of is, see, like, especially just like being 20 here and being around the college campus and like much more, you know, just not as conservative, like thinking. It's interesting because a lot of times when I share my experience here, how I have experienced personal racism and I have felt a lack of opportunity here, they're like, well, at least you're in Missouri, like at least in Montana, like this is the best place. And that is really, really hard for me because yes, at least I'm here, but some of my friends tell me don't drive 20 minutes out this way. I've experienced things just within this own town. And so my thing is, I think people think we are creating space for Black people and Black voices, but that space is still not enough for all of us. And there isn't even this realization that we are not doing well as a community. I mean, I'm a part of the Black Student Union, and I've shared with Tobin that these last 2 years since the insurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's been hell. Because suddenly it's like people are so polarized in politics when it should just be a humanities, like a human right that we're standing up for, instead of this political divergence between two groups. Because really, we should be fighting for people's lives. And it's super hard for me because suddenly I'm that one Black friend that people, especially that are originally from Montana, have ever had. So now I have this responsibility to teach them everything. And I'm like one of those Black people that is approachable. And so people say really ignorant things to me. And I'm like, well, if I don't correct them, who else will? And even in my studies, I see it. I'm taking a women and gender studies class. And last semester, I took a Black women and gender studies class by a Black professor. And I mean, the content is like completely different because the feminist movement didn't include the narratives of brown and Black women. And so it's like learning completely two different languages, understanding the dates that they overlap, and these two completely different narratives that are told, and the white one is the one that's instilled in our brains from a very young age. So what about girls like me? What about kids like me? And that is like the lack of representation that's in this town. Like if I look, I mean, I love Tobin, he knows this, but the first day that I was like, you know, in Montana, going on my Zoom class, freshman year in my cute dorm, over decoratedly pink, and like I pop up a screen, I'm like, it's, you know, Black African hip hop class, and it's a white man, and I'm like, I think I had to turn off my camera and like, because like finally I was going to a place where you can pick what major you want to be in, and I've always wanted to study this. And Tobin, within the five seconds, he's like, I know I'm not a Black person, and I was immediately like, okay, we're on the same page. But there are people that when I do speak to them, I don't think that they understand that my experience is very different. And so I'm so willing to talk to people, and on campus, I'm trying to create discussion groups because I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the YouTube channel, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man with Emmanuel Ochoa, who is an ex-Philadelphia NFL player. I could add the link, or I don't know how to do that, but if I do. And it just breaks down so many things that, like, why shouldn't white people say the N-word? Why, you know, like, what is that historically? It's a historically oppressive. Why do we use it, reclaim it, re-own it? And so I'm trying to create in small groups, but there is like my own mental health piece. And that's, again, lack of representation and lack of help for mental health. And then in school, we're expected, you know, keep up, submit all these things. And our lives, we're fighting for our lives. And so I don't even think that education is equitable. And that's what I'm paying for, you know what I mean? So I just don't understand how we keep having those conversations, and people think that there's progress, but I still am struggling to want to live in this place. And how many of my friends have struggled with that same.
You said something earlier that I think is actually incredibly deeply, deeply relevant for me as a person, and why I felt kind of compelled to continue on with this work. Because I likely came from, I like to think I come from a community and a family that was, very progressively minded and open. And when I first, not because I chose to, but because I was kind of put into it by people I was working with at the Historical Society, given this project, when I first came across the stories of people from my hometown in a place, and I was a history major and working as a young historian, and I was convinced that that was the history that I knew and lived and breathed. And I came across people's, they're in the book, the Driver family. They owned this building that now a good friend of my family, his bike shop is in. And suddenly there was some weird disconnect that hit me. That's not only do I not know this history, but likely my belief that I am the good, progressive, open person is probably not nearly as expansive as I like to imagine it is. And the work that I needed to begin doing just as a person, let alone as someone who wanted to maybe study race in the West and write about it, it really, from the very moment I kind of encountered these stories and realized that I did not know the history of the place that I call home. And I don't know what that history actually might in the future mean for me as I try to live in a broader community. I think that was probably the very beginning of thinking that just kind of telling a history or telling stories that maybe are fun and novel, because to liberal, progressive-minded people, they're just unexpected. That wasn't going to be what I wanted to do at all. And I wanted instead to try and find a way to just begin a conversation in which, one, I'm not going to be the last person at all who takes up this subject historically or in any other kind of discipline. I hope that is clear from the book, that there are literally thousands of other stories which go untold, and have, each of them has the ability to kind of widen narrow worldviews and impart measures of historical empathy and kind of create a fuller meaning of home for all people in this place. But at the same time, I also come to this space where I feel like this is going to be an ever evolving and constant project. And it's not going to be a matter of, well, now we've told the history of Black people in Montana and we can move on to tell the history of someone else and just add it to the canon and not let it change the way we live in our world. So it is both, difficult, but in many ways not unexpected to hear you talk about your challenges, because as I was working through this, they were voiced over and over and over again by people working through the public history project that began in Helena. But certainly I hope that if anything else, that the book can at least signal to many different types of people with various experiences, and hopefully to young Black students who want to be, historians in their own way. Like, this is a field and a subject that has just an incredible ability to change the way that we live in our world and kind of move around and to decide how do we want to make a better future. And I think that this is a wonderful space to do it. So thank you for all your wonderful comments.
Maybe I'll jump in and make some connections real briefly. And then I note that there's some great questions coming in the Q&A as well, that I think, and particularly Anthony, you'll be able to offer some comments to. And maybe while you're preparing for that, I can just bridge a little bit, because I think one thing that Amelu has done for us is stress again the importance of how our scholarship is always received and enters into real world situations. And one of the things I think, as you've spoken to, Anthony, here, you are lifting up an experience of a community which can support the kind of realities that Amelu is trusted with in telling her own story. Up to just the last number of years, as we've talked about the experience of African Americans in Montana, much of the conversation has gone either in trying to explain a curiosity or explaining an anomaly. Mm-hmm. So that it was a white and, to a degree, a Native history that had been told in the popular narrative, and that Black history at most is going to reference the experience of the so-called Buffalo soldiers, the 24th and 25th regiments out at Fort Missoula, and that's about it. Maybe you're going to get an individual here or there, highly charismatic individual, but it's not going to be a story that is integrated into the story of Montana as it's told in popular sort of discourse and narratives. I think what you've done here is begun to move us in that direction where the African-American experience isn't an exception to what's happening in our state, but it's at the root and the center of what's happened in our state. And lifting up these stories, putting it in the context of colonialism and in that broader discourse of how African Americans participated in or resisted that process is just so essential to helping us understand that story with much more complexity, with much more nuance. One of the things I talk about in my class is that there are 5 traps of African American history writ large. There's the trap of the victim, where African Americans are often put in the position of doing nothing but having been victimized. There's the trap of the newsreel, where we only pay attention to things that showed up in the newspaper or in the evening news. There's the trap of the compound, as if suggested African-American history only counts for the African-American community and isn't something all of us should know. There's the trap of presentism, which is suggesting that the only thing that counts is if it's directly connected to our present reality. And there's the trap of the superhero, of taking someone like King and only talking about him as if he was above normal human interaction without looking at his failings. I think your book avoids every one of those traps. It's presented so that it's an important story for all of Montanans to know, avoiding the trap of the compound. It avoids the trap of the victim really well by talking about the agency of the African-American community. It avoids the cap of the newsreel by getting us deeper into the story. It avoids the presentist trap by taking the terms on their own. And it avoids the superhero trap by presenting your figures in all their complexity. So I just want to affirm how much important work's being done here, and how it offers another narrative to speak to the kind of realities that Amelu has brought before us so eloquently previously. But there's some great questions emerging in that Q&A. Do you want to pick up some of them, Anthony?
Yeah,
and then maybe.
Yeah, I saw the first one, and I think actually your comment helps answer it in certain ways. The first question, which was regarding how Black history, Black individuals, and indigenous people in Montana interact in the book. How do they play? One of the traps, as you mentioned, which I had in my training as like a Western historian, was to avoid the Herbert Ruffin, who's a wonderful historian of the Black West, has recently kind of called it the "we were there" narrative, in which sometimes it is members of the Black community, but most often it's well-meaning white historians who want to diversify the old Western mythologies. So in order to do so, they just tell the story of a notable Black individual or just a community, and really leave the agency of them either fully in line with whatever story is already in place, whatever narrative about the past we already tell, leaves it intact and really just changes the face just a little bit, which is an unhelpful, as he points out, which is a very unhelpful paradigm to do history with. And in Montana's case, one of the main kind of drivers of historical storytelling, especially from the late 19th century to the 20th, is the remarkable shift in territory and in sovereignty of indigenous people, such that before the end of Greater Reconstruction in the 1870s, Montana is primarily an indigenous space. I mean, I go to pains in many of the chapters to point out that what we are really looking at on the ground is specks of settler encampments along rivers or near kind of prosperous mining districts in a much larger territory that is controlled demographically by numbers and politically and socially by indigenous peoples into the late 1870s. And then that shift, which is often the story that Montana tells about itself, both through state historians of the last 50 years or so, and as well as locally within communities, is the the establishment of white communities and the kind of the growth of the state government, and then this kind of fostering of what it means to be a Montanan. That is very prevalent in especially smaller communities. And that story has Indigenous people within it, but often in this passive, poorly articulated role. And so I was trying to avoid talking about African Americans as if they were fully and totally and unproblematically engaged in that process, and ones that Indigenous people kind of remain passive and non-actors, but also avoid making African Americans non-actors in that story as well. And to do that, you have to fully consider the interactions that African Americans have, or in the case of the book, don't have, where you would expect them to. And this was kind of going to back to one of Amelia's really good points, where you would expect to find the solidarity, and when you don't, that should tell us something. And in this case, for my story at least, it is recognizing that the growth of the Black community is taking place primarily at a moment in the historical past in which Indigenous peoples are really struggling within their communities to fight the new kind of onslaught of allotment and dispossession. And what we can't assume is that somehow the struggle of Indigenous peoples and the prosperity of Black communities that are growing pretty prodigiously in the early 20th century are somehow totally disassociated from one another. But without the sources, we haven't found leading members of the Black community writing at length about the question of Indigenous dispossession. What we're forced to do is kind of think about, well, how are they building their lives? What are the things they value? Do they value property and home and material possessions? Do they value institutions that allow them to voice their opinions in a democracy? Where they're placing their values within the growth of their communities can tell us a great deal how it is connected to the wider project of settler colonialism. And it is not an uncomplicated connection. And I think that I will continue in my work going forward. I will continue to encounter these connections and make sense of them and constantly place them in context. But to do so, I think we need to first recognize that it's not going to be a simple task, that telling Black history in Montana and telling Montana's history is never going to be just a straightforward, fun Old West narrative. So I think that the question specifically asked kind of where these interactions take place. And one of the things we can see, the most clear and constant references of connections, besides a couple individuals and families which are intermarried and half Native, half Black, living in different places across the state, which does happen, apart from the Buffalo Soldier narrative, which I do try to complicate, but have to retell because it's just one of those openings that so many people already know, and I wanted to kind of explore that further. The main one is actually the discussion of what African Americans in Montana and across the country should do, given the news that large reservations in Montana are being allotted in the early 20th century, and that this land is very cheap and in some cases even free through a lottery. And there is a racial component to especially the more conservative Black press that exists in Montana in these times, as well as nationally. I pulled in some examples from Denver and the Chicago Defender that is calling on African Americans to kind of go rush and claim newly allotted Indigenous lands. And to do so, they're kind of leaning heavily into this very conservative social ideology of the day, which is most commonly associated with Booker T. Washington. And just because in Montana we happen to have only the two newspapers and the Black press that is leaning on Washington's ideology, I also try to show that nationally he is not uncontested. And in fact, I think that in and of itself should suggest that though we don't have the voices that are articulating that position, there is a a kind of W.E.B. Du Boisian or an Ida B. Wells style of engaging with politics that likely exists in all Black communities. Just because we only have Booker T. Washington's insistence on material prosperity does not mean that is the only way that Black settlers are imagining themselves. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Amelu, there's a specific question for you. Do you see that in the Q&A? Would you like to pick up on that?
Amelu, what do you wish for your time in the Montana University system? What comes of it? Do you plan to stay after graduating? Okay. Yeah, no. I am trying to move to New York in the summertime, go to NYU or Columbia. I have had such a traumatic experience at this school. I found really great things about it and some friendships, but a lot of things I've experienced here is a feeling of like isolation and aloneness. And I have a very interesting story because I'm actually from Ethiopia and I lived there until I was 6 years old and came from really, really hard conditions. Like I didn't have shoes for the first 6 years of my life. I was extremely malnourished when I came to the States. And then I was adopted into a white family with my brother. And the parents got divorced 4 months after they adopted me. Just a lot of family problems, a lot of alcohol abuse. And so I just kind of grew up with this feeling of floating around. And the concept of home that Anthony brings up is really sensitive. And I wrote it down on here because I feel like my whole life, which I'm only 20, which is not that significant, but I feel like I've been a wanderer. And maybe that's part of the way I'm wired because I do have this, not to be arrogant, but I do have this way of like coming into people's life and like shining light and being like, here are the things that opportunity to grow. Here's the way I can love you. And then I leave. And I want to go on different journeys and meet as many people as I can. But I think, honestly, I look at it in that perspective because it's easier to than this feeling of loneliness and this feeling of displacement. And, you know, my adoption was very corrupt. And so my brother and I were actually taken from our village. And we did have a family there, and there was no communication between this Christian adoption agency and my adopted parents. That I had 2 siblings that I was taking care of, as well as a birth mom that was there. My dad had passed away by the age of 4 from malaria. And so it's really hard for me to feel like there's a sense of community. And I think it's because even within the Black Student Union, I am very different from their stories. And I think that's what I wrote in one of my response papers for the Women and Genders class, is that there is no singular story of a Black person. And I feel like sometimes people code it with this, like, oh, every Black person has experienced the same oppression, but that's not true because I grew up in a white family with white privilege. Like I did have that when I was with my white family. Now, if I went to the grocery store just with my Black brother and I would get followed around, watched, like he had to put his hood down and hands out of his pocket. But if we brought our white sister with big blue eyes and freckles, no one cared. And so those were the systems I was working in. And I knew that I used my white privilege. But then when I came out here, I came on a scholarship for cross country and track. And I just quit because of an eating disorder. And the coach I had extreme problems with. He was extremely ignorant in race-related things, and I tried to discuss it with him, and there was just this unwillingness to sit in the discomfort, like I said in the chat. And I was the only Black athlete on his distance team, and so I was like, there are major problems, and he wasn't willing to look at that, so I quit. But like to come here, like expecting to have a community at first with running, and then maybe like find the Black Student Union and really reach out to clubs because I'd had more time. And even within the Black Student Union, there's just this level of discomfort. And there has been this place of you are not Black enough to exist even in this space. And that's particularly because of someone in that group that is from a very hard, impoverished Colorado, kind of like more ghetto community, which he likes to talk about. But it's hard because he's like, I'm sorry, but you don't know what it's like. You don't know what it's like to like have shootings at your schools. And I'm like, you don't know what it's like to not have shoes for the first 6 years of your life. To not know where your next meal is coming from. No food bank, no food stamps. And so if you really want to play that card, like that's what I mean is there's not even space for us Black people here because now there's this level of threat of like, no one understands me. So there's this deep need to be understood. And people can't understand because I am an immigrant to the States. I did not choose to be here. And then like in 2016, I went and visited my birth family because we found them after 10 years. Reconnected with my birth mom, my whole village, and my sister. And my sister kept asking me, take me back to America, take me back. And I thought, wow, how can I be so depressed? You're so suicidal here. But it's because there is this ideal representation of what America is supposed to be like. And it's just not the truth. Because they don't have that oppression of racism in the extent, like there is political warfare, but like it's not because you're Black. We're all Black. It's just different tribes,
Right.
different cultures. But here it's like, oh my God, you are other. And like, you don't understand how many comments I get in this town everywhere I go. Oh my God, your hair is incredible. And they never know what it is. Like, they never know what kind of style it is. They don't even care to ask. They want to touch it. Men here are really scary for me because I don't know what their motivation is. Are they trying to be the hero? Are they weird, like fascination, kind of like you are so like an anomaly, like Tobin was saying. And so even those relationships are super. And so I don't want to stay here, but after a few traumas through the summer, I realized, I have to stick here until my mental health and my doctors are all aligned and I'm like stable. But I can't be here for my mental health because this was the lowest I have ever been, ever in my life. And that's how the successful Black students feel. Like, I just came out of the hospital. Like, I am not well and we are not well. And I just like I zoomed with Tobin and was like, we need help. We need help. And so I feel like for this year, that's my work, is to say my voice, and I'm trying to publish some things and be on discussion panels, but there's only so much energy that I have to give to this, because what about my creative outlets? What about my mental health? What about, I can't ever sleep. All my areas of interest are watching documentaries about oppression, reading books, and my doctors are like, what's your fun thing? I'm like, well, I rollerblade for 8 hours a day. So that seems unhealthy. I'm really strong from it, but it's not healthy. And so I guess like I don't want to stay here, but I'm worried what will happen if I leave. Yeah. Because I feel like I am kind of carrying a lot of the Black folks, and I don't want to be carrying anyone. And yeah, so I guess that's the best way I can explain it. But there's this deep desire that if I do live in this world, when I was in the hospital, there's a lot of time to think about, how did I get here? How did I get to the point of not wanting to live? And it was just this like, it wasn't that I wanted to kill myself. It was the fact that I couldn't live in a space like this, in a space where I felt such isolation, such difference. And so if I can create and foster this community of people who are willing to sit in discomfort, then absolutely I'm willing to live. But it has to, either my environment needs to change, the people around it, something has to change, because it's so exhausting. And I'm 20.
Yeah. Thanks again, Amelu, for being so honest within this discussion. Sometimes we academics don't remember that, again, our work is in the midst of very real lived experiences. So your trust in honoring us with that story again, yeah, thank you very much. Anthony, there's another question I think that connects to what Amelu's been again sharing with us, particularly the experience of Black women. I know you begin and end your book with the stories of Rose Gordon, but do you want to speak more broadly about the question that's raised here?
Yeah, and it actually, the question about the place of Black women in Montana's history begins in something which I don't really mention it too much in the book, and it is there is an expectation, and there has been for decades and decades, about the stories of Black women in Montana, in which a lot of people who I've been discussing the book with, they will note to me that that's actually, there's a handful of Black women. Rose Gordon is one of them, but mostly like Mary Fields from Cascade and Great Falls, or Annie Morgan. from over by Phillipsburg that has a very interesting backstory. There's a handful of Black women across the state in which the communities that they were a part know their stories very well and retell them over and over and over again. But it has become this kind of, it falls into the trap of like the superhero or the individual, as you were mentioning earlier. And then what you start trying to kind of work against is that the assumption is that these 5 or 6 women in Montana's history kind of can somehow stand in for the experiences of Black women kind of broadly, which is just not the case. And so many of them, of the people that we remember, the reason why we remember them is because their stories and their lives fit so perfectly into this narrative, or we have made them fit so perfectly into this narrative of what it would mean to be a Black woman in Montana. And so often that is, they are not allowed to be mothers to their own children, either because they don't have children, because they're forced to send them away. Sarah Bickford from Virginia City, which has a new wonderful biography about her, fits into this category, in which she had to, she felt it was pertinent to make her children leave Montana to find Black communities elsewhere, to find families that weren't part of the community which she was a part of in Virginia City. But at the same time, her and many other Black women from this era of the book that I discussed were expected to be maternal, or expected to be mothers to their community, and that's how they're remembered and beloved as mothers to the community, in spite of the fact that many of them did not get to be mothers either to their own children, or in the case of Rose Gordon, at all. Remained single her whole life, and I struggled with that, because you want to be able to tell stories that captivate people. But the stories that I also found of Black women in Montana is usually deeply ingrained in the concept of kind of continuing communities, being this impetus in settler society, which is one of the chapters I discuss, is the ban on interracial marriage in 1909, and how this would look to not only Black men and women in interracial marriages or partnerships, but to single people generally in Montana. And in this case, I think we can start kind of to piece together some of the effects of very particularly colonial form of racism in Montana, and kind of observe what happens in the decades after this law is passed. And it shows itself, I think, demographically through stories, to be deeply challenging for young Black women especially. There's one little account that I didn't make it into the book. I found it a little bit afterwards. And it's from the newspaper in Missoula, actually. A young Black woman in the 1920s marries a childhood friend of hers, and the newspaper report says that she has gone to live with her husband now in Spokane, and they note that the marriage pool of Missoula has been totally emptied for African Americans, and it's not sure when it will ever, when an eligible Black woman will come around again. Like, that's literally the language that the white paper noted, meaning that it had nothing to do with whether or not they even were thinking about the marriage ban at the time, but there was just this deep assumption about Black women's lives, which was just so pervasive, that in this woman's marriage announcement, they noted that there were no more opportunities for young Black people in Missoula to find partners. Right. But there were Black people in Missoula who could have, but through this marriage ban had, legally made that impossible. But in other ways, I argue that it was more important that it had made it culturally and socially impossible within this society at the same time. There are also a number of other stories which we kind of hold dear, and Black women themselves, as far as we can tell, kind of told and retold about themselves to root themselves in this place, which is how I use and think about the stories that Rose Gordon wrote about herself. Mm-hmm. They're deeply moving in all kinds of ways, and it's because she spent a lifetime of putting her experiences and thoughts to paper. And there is a book coming out from the Montana Historical Society very soon on her specifically. So I would encourage everyone to wait and be aware of that as well. So.
Well, I'm aware that we're nearing the end of our hour here, and we had discussed as a sort of a poetic wrap up for what we've done here, inviting Amelu to close with a poem she's written coming out of a class she's taking in the African American Studies program at the University of Montana right now. I just want to thank you again, Anthony, for this incredible book you've written in expanding our scholarship on the history of African Americans in the state. The contributions, I think, will only begin to grow as we continue to have conversations about the history you've brought to our collective attention. So just want to thank you again for the work you've done. It's a real gift to us all. Amelie, do you want to close with your poem? You've got about 3 minutes left, so that would work perfectly.
Called Opening the Textbook. Opening the textbook, reading them lies, died a million times over. I guess we stopped breathing a long while ago before you yelled George Floyd. We've been holding our breath longer than 8:46 before you decided his life didn't matter, but now my life matters, or don't it? Waving that ugly blue with an American flag, all lives matter, how gross. Wish they hadn't whipped us, made me cry reading the books with my body looking like their backs beaten, exhausted, exasperated, the earth no longer known. Not the way you hurted us, keep hurting, entrenching our narratives and trauma, the generational kind, the deep-rooted, marinated with hate kind of pain. I could hate y'all. I know some that do. I ain't been like that since I was born, seeing the good too much too soon. Don't realize how much you want to see me die or drown, sinking my head below. We are gasping for a chance at change. You won't reiterate what we've spoken and speak, protesting and calling us free until freedom is ours, until you stop killing us, until you stop exploiting the heritage we knew. Erase because my face is too scary, or my black brother in a hoodie in Idaho and Trayvon Martin reminding me we all could be killed. My brother standing there with his hands tucked away, a black hoodie encompassing his face. You won't ever see his hunger-filled eyes fighting for life before these white Americans came to our native land, taking us back to a home which we didn't know. Don't tell me his life doesn't matter. Don't you dare. I don't want to be no Emmett Till. That kind of shit rips at my throat, makes me cry, my bones quivering. 14 years old, dead, mutilated. How did they all not know? 14 dead, mutilated. Why didn't y'all know or care? His mom been crying and begging for help. We hurting, we hurting, we hurting. Please stop this pain. Help me breathe.
Thank you, Amelu. That was, again, a gift to us all. I think we'll turn it back to Montana Book Festival.
Thank you, Amelu. That was beautiful and powerful, and this conversation was so necessary. Thank you, Anthony, for Black Montana. Thank you, Tobin, for kind of moderating this conversation. All of this, I'm so glad that we were able to host you guys today. That was really wonderful. So thank you, Anthony, Tobin, and Amelu this morning. Thank you, audience, for being here and asking really engaging questions. And thank you again to our event sponsors, Arts Missoula, MissoulaEvents.net, the Whitefish Review, Humanities Montana, and the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation. Just another reminder, you can purchase Anthony's book or any of the books really that we heard about during this conversation at Fact and Fiction Books. Be sure to enter the code MBF at checkout, whether that's in store, you can tell your bookseller MBF, or you can enter MBF at checkout at factandfictionbooks.com. So thank you again, you three. I'm honored to have hosted you again, and I hope you have a wonderful Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you so